The Oval Office smelled of cigarette smoke and despair. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sat hunched over his desk, a half-burned camel dangling from his lips, ash dusting the decoded cable in front of him. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, not from the polio that had stolen his legs, but from the weight of what it said. Intercepted Japanese chatter cracked through the purple cipher, whispered of naval movements, of a strike somewhere in the Pacific. Coordinates danced in the margins, scribbled by some sleepless cryptanalyst. 21 degrees north, 158 degrees west. Too close to Hawaii. Too close to Pearl. Harry Hopkins paced behind him, the advisor's gaunt frame casting a shadow over the desk. "They're starving, Franklin," he said, voice rough as gravel. "The oil embargo's got Japan by the throat. They'll hit us somewhere, Philippines, maybe Guam. We can't just sit here." Roosevelt exhaled a plume of smoke, eyes narrowing. "And what do I tell the mothers of those boys when the telegrams come? That we started a war they didn't want." He tapped the cable with a nicotine-stained finger. "Congress won't move. The people won't move. Not unless—" He stopped himself, but the thought hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Harry froze, staring at him. "Unless what?" The door burst open before Roosevelt could answer, admitting Secretary of State Cordell Hull. The man's face was a mask of exhaustion, tie askew, gray hair plastered with sweat. "Mr. President, Tokyo's stalling again. Their ambassadors are feeding us nonsense, trade talks, peace assurances. It's a damn smokescreen." Roosevelt leaned back in his wheelchair, the leather creaking. "They're buying time, Cordell. Time for what, I wonder?" His gaze flicked to the cable again, those cursed coordinates burning into his mind. A sharp knock interrupted them, followed by a young woman in a crisp Navy uniform shoving her way past the aide at the door. Lieutenant Margaret Garland. Maggie, to the few who dared familiarity, clutched a fresh intercept, her green eyes wild with urgency. She was barely 25, but the war's shadow had etched lines into her face. "Sir," she said, breathless, thrusting the paper at Roosevelt. "This just came through. It's not just chatter anymore, it's orders. Carriers. Planes. They're moving and Pearl's in their path." Hull snatched the sheet, scanning it. "Good God, Maggie, this is speculation. You're piecing together fragments." "It's not fragments," she snapped, voice cracking. "The pattern's there, fleet movements, radio silence, the works. I've been up 3 nights straight on this. They're coming, sir, and soon." Roosevelt took the paper from Hull, his hand steady now, deliberate. He read it silently, lips thinning into a line. Maggie's words echoed, "Pearls in their path." He saw the harbor in his mind, battleships lined up like dominoes, sailors laughing over beers, oblivious. He saw the flames too, the screams, the bodies. And beyond that, he saw Hitler's tanks rolling over Europe, Japan's flag rising over Asia, a world choking under swastikas and rising suns. "Mr. President?" Maggie pressed, stepping closer. "We can warn them. Kimmel can scramble the fleet. Get the carriers out." "No," Roosevelt said, voice low but firm. He crushed his cigarette into the ashtray, embers flaring briefly. "Not yet." Maggie blinked, stunned. "Sir?" Hull turned on him, incredulous. "Franklin, if she's right." "She might be," Roosevelt cut in sharper now. "And if she is, what then? We sound the alarm, Japan backs off, and we're left with a nation that still thinks this war's someone else's problem. Hitler carves up the globe while we twiddle our thumbs." Harry's shadow loomed closer. "You're saying we let it happen?" "I'm saying we don't have a choice," Roosevelt shot back, eyes blazing. "They won't fight unless they bleed, Harry. You know it. Cordell knows it. 2 years of speeches, embargoes, lend-lease. They still think the Atlantic's a wall. It's not. It's a goddamn fuse, and it's lit." Maggie's hands balled into fists. "You're talking about lives, sir. Thousands of them. My brother's at Pearl. He's a gunner on the Arizona." Roosevelt's jaw tightened, but he met her gaze. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant. Truly. But this isn't about one ship, one boy. It's about millions. If we don't wake up now, there won't be a world left to save." She stared at him, tears brimming, then spun on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door. The room fell silent, save for the tick of the clock on the mantel. Hull rubbed his temples, muttering, "Christ, Franklin, I hope you're wrong." "I hope I am too," Roosevelt said, but his voice was hollow. He waved them out. "Leave me. Both of you." They obeyed, footsteps fading down the hall. Alone, Roosevelt pulled a matchbook from his drawer, struck a flame, and held it to Maggie's intercept. The paper curled and blackened, coordinates vanishing into ash that drifted to the carpet like snow. He watched it burn, his mind racing. He'd pushed Japan hard, cut their oil, their steel, their lifeline. A desperate dog bites, he'd told himself then. Now the bite was coming, and he'd let it land. Not because he wanted to, God, no, but because the math didn't lie. One strike, one shock, could rouse a sleeping giant. Without it, the Axis would grind humanity to dust. The phone rang, shrill and insistent. He ignored it, lighting another cigarette instead. The smoke curled upward, a ghost of the fire he'd just extinguished. He thought of Maggie's brother, faceless but real, and the others, sailors, pilots, kids who'd never see Christmas. His chest tightened, a pang he couldn't shake. Outside, the November wind howled against the White House windows, rattling the panes like a warning. Roosevelt closed his eyes, picturing Pearl Harbor at dawn, calm, unsuspecting, doomed. He saw the planes too, black specks on the horizon, growing larger. He saw the explosions, the water boiling red. They won't forgive me, he whispered to the empty room. But they'll fight. The ash pile on his desk grew, a tiny graveyard of secrets. He reached for the cable again, the first one, and traced the coordinates with a trembling finger. 21 degrees north, 158 degrees west. Pearl Harbor. The matchbox sat open beside him, a single stick left. He didn't light it, not yet. But he knew he would soon enough. The clock struck midnight. Somewhere across the Pacific, a Japanese fleet cut through the dark, silent as death. And in Washington, a president sat alone, waiting for the world to change. The sun dipped low over Pearl Harbor, painting the water gold and red, a cruel mockery of the blood Lieutenant Commander Daniel Harrow knew might spill there soon. He stood on the deck of the USS Pennsylvania, hands gripping the railing, eyes fixed on the row of battleships moored along Battleship Row, Nevada, Arizona, Oklahoma, all lined up like targets at a shooting range. The air smelled of salt and oil, and the hum of sailors' laughter drifted from below decks. Dan's gut twisted. They didn't know. None of them did. Too damn quiet, he muttered, scanning the horizon. The Pacific stretched endless and empty, but he'd seen the reports. Japan's carriers had gone dark, their radio chatter snuffed out like a candle. He'd asked Admiral Husband Kimmel about it that morning, voice tight with unease. "Sir, why aren't we dispersing the fleet? If they hit us here..." Kimmel had cut him off, his face a mask of tired authority. "Orders from Washington, Harrow. The fleet stays put. Show of strength, they say." He'd waved a hand, dismissive, and turned back to his charts. Show of strength. Dan spat over the rail, the taste of bile rising. A show of strength didn't mean tying your hands behind your back. He'd served 10 years in the Navy, seen action in the Atlantic, and he knew a trap when he smelled one. This wasn't strategy. This was bait. His boots clanged on the steel stairs as he descended to the radio room. Henry Murphy, a lanky radar tech with a grin too big for his face, was hunched over a stack of logs, pencil scratching. "Hey, boss," Henry said without looking up. "You look like you swallowed a live eel." "Feel like it too," Dan said, dropping into a chair. "What's the latest on those Jap carriers?" Henry's grin faded. He slid a report across the table, smudged with coffee stains. "Nada. 6 carriers, Akagi Kaga, the big ones, haven't pinged in days. Last we heard, they were steaming north, then poof. Ghost ships." Dan's eyes narrowed, tracing the faded ink. North could mean anywhere. Aleutians. Philippines. He paused, voice dropping. Or here. Henry leaned back, crossing his arms. "You're paranoid, man. They'd have to be nuts to hit Pearl. Too far, too risky." "Or too desperate," Dan countered. "We've choked their oil, Henry. Cut their steel. A cornered dog doesn't care about risk, it bites." The tech shrugged, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Dan stood, pacing the cramped room, the hum of the radio static buzzing like flies in his skull. He thought of Roosevelt, that voice on the airwaves preaching preparedness while the fleet sat here, fat and exposed. Why? Why keep them pinned when every instinct screamed to scatter? 1,000 miles away, in a dimly lit White House study, Franklin Roosevelt stubbed out his 5th cigarette of the hour. General George Marshall sat across from him, ramrod straight, his uniform crisp against the sagging velvet chairs. A map of Europe and Asia sprawled between them, red lines marking Hitler's advance, black arrows tracing Japan's hunger. "They're moving, George," Roosevelt said, voice raspy. "The intercepts don't lie. Japan's ready to strike." Marshall's jaw tightened. "Where, sir?" "We've got guesses, Singapore, Manila, but no hard target." Roosevelt's eyes flicked to the Pacific, to a tiny dot labeled Oahu. He didn't answer directly. If they hit us, how bad? Bad, Marshall said flatly. Pearl's a sitting duck. Battleships in tight, carriers out on patrol. Thousands dead, maybe half the fleet crippled. But we'd recover. Eventually. Eventually, Roosevelt echoed, a bitter edge to the word. He lit another Camel, the flare of the match casting shadows across his haggard face. And if we dodge it? Warn them, pull the fleet. Marshall hesitated then. Japan backs off. We stay out. Hitler takes Moscow by spring, London by 43. Japan swallows China, then India. No one stops them. Roosevelt exhaled, smoke curling like a noose. Casualties are the price of waking a giant, George. You said it yourself last week. I did, Marshall admitted, voice low. But it's a hell of a price, Mr. President. It is, Roosevelt said, staring at the map. But if we don't pay it now, the bill comes due later, in millions, not thousands. He tapped Oahu with a trembling finger. They'll hate me for it. History will. But the world might live. Back at Pearl, Dan left the radio room, the sunset now a thin crimson slash on the horizon. He found Kimmel on the docks, inspecting a destroyer's hull. The admiral's white uniform gleamed in the fading light, a beacon of calm Dan wanted to shake. Sir, Dan said, saluting stiffly. The carriers are still dark. We've got no eyes out there. Why aren't we moving? Kimmel turned, eyes weary but sharp. I told you, Harrow, Washington's call. They want Japan to see us standing tall. Dispersing looks like fear. Standing tall? Dan's voice rose, barely controlled. It looks like a bullseye. If they hit us here, then we fight, Kimmel snapped, cutting him off. And we win. That's the job. Go check your ship, Commander. Dismissed. Dan held his gaze a beat too long, then turned away, fists clenched. He didn't salute again. The Admiral's words rang hollow, a script someone else had written. Washington. Roosevelt. He could feel it, a shadow behind the orders, but he couldn't name it, not yet. The night deepened as Dan walked the docks, the fleet's lights twinkling like stars against the black water. He stopped at the Arizona, her massive guns silent, her crew's chatter drifting down. He thought of his wife back in San Diego, her last letter tucked in his pocket. Come home safe, Danny. He hadn't written back yet. Didn't know what to say. A faint hum broke his reverie, distant, mechanical, barely audible over the waves. He froze, head tilting toward the northwest. Birds? No, too steady. He grabbed his binoculars from his belt, glassing the horizon. Nothing but dark sea and sky. The hum grew, a low thrum in his bones. Henry, he shouted, sprinting back toward the radio shack. The tech poked his head out, frowning. You hear that? Dan asked, breathless. Henry cocked his head, then paled. Engines. Planes. Dan didn't answer. He shoved past, grabbing the radio mic base. This is Harrow on Pennsylvania. Unknown aircraft inbound, northwest vector. Confirm, over. Static crackled, then a bored voice. Stand by, Commander. Probably our B-17s from the mainland. Relax. Relax. Dan snarled, but the line went dead. He slammed the mic down, turning to Henry. Get to the radar station. Now. Henry bolted, and Dan stepped outside, binoculars back to his eyes. The hum was louder, unmistakable. Shadows flickered on the edge of sight, low, fast, too many. His heart slammed against his ribs. They were coming, and no one was ready. The pre-dawn air at the Opana radar station hung heavy, thick with humidity and the sour tang of Henry Murphy's third coffee. He slouched over the scope, eyes bleary, the green glow flickering with static. It was 6:55 a.m., December 7th, 1941, and Oahu slept under a blanket of stars. Henry rubbed his face, muttering, Come on, shift's almost over. Then the screen blipped, a cluster of dots, faint but growing, northwest, 130 miles out. He sat up, heart kicking. What the hell? He twisted dials, sharpening the signal. The cluster swelled, dozens, maybe hundreds, moving fast. Too fast for freighters. Too many for birds. He snatched the phone, cranking the line to the information center. Hey, Tyler, it's Murphy at Opana. I've got bogies inbound, big group. You seeing this? Lieutenant Kermit Tyler's voice crackled back, lazy and annoyed. Yeah, we got it. Probably those B-17s from California. Schedule's off, but they're due in soon. Stand down, Murphy. Henry frowned, eyes locked on the scope. The blips didn't move like lumbering bombers. They streaked, tight and purposeful. Sir, these ain't B-17s. Too many, too quick. Murphy, Tyler snapped. I said stand down. Washington's got bigger fish to fry. Log it and relax. The line clicked dead. Henry slammed the receiver, cursing under his breath. He scribbled the sighting, 0645, 137 miles northwest, large formation, and stared at the scope, the dots creeping closer. His gut screamed warning, but Tyler's dismissal echoed louder. He grabbed his cap and bolted for the Jeep. Dan needed to know. In Washington, Franklin Roosevelt paced the map room, his wheelchair abandoned for a rare, painful stint on crutches. The clock read 1:55 a.m., but sleep was a distant memory. Harry Hopkins slumped in a chair, nursing a whiskey, while a radio hummed static in the corner. A teletype spat out a fresh message. Japanese ambassadors stalling again, their latest piece offer a tangle of lies. They're done talking, Roosevelt said, voice low, almost a growl. He leaned on the map table, knuckles white. It's happening. Hopkins looked up, eyes bloodshot. Pearl? Roosevelt nodded, once sharp. The intercepts were clear. Carriers slipped out of sight days ago. They're there. He tapped Oahu with a crutch, the thud echoing like a gavel. Hopkins drained his glass. You could still call Kimmel. Scramble the fleet. Hell, Franklin, it's not too late. It is, Roosevelt cut in voice steel. If we dodge this, Japan retreats, and we're back to square one, watching Hitler burn Europe while Congress debates farm subsidies. No. They hit us, we hit back. The world turns. Hopkins stared, then looked away, muttering, God help us. Back at Pearl, Dan Harrow sprinted across the docks, Henry's Jeep skidding to a stop beside him. The sky was bruising purple, dawn teasing the horizon. Dan! Henry shouted, leaping out. Radars lit up, planes, a swarm of M, coming fast. Dan's blood ran cold. You sure? Dead sure, Henry said, breathless. Tyler says it's B-17s, but I've tracked those. They don't move like this. I told base, but they're sitting on their hands. Dan grabbed his shoulder, eyes blazing. Get to the Pennsylvania's guns. Now! He turned, shouting to a cluster of sailors smoking on the pier. Sound the alarm. Incoming, northwest. A petty officer laughed, flicking his cigarette. Ease up, Commander. It's Sunday. The hum hit then, low and growing, a swarm of bees boiling over the hills. Dan's head snapped up as black specks dotted the sky, glinting in the first light. Zeros, Valdive bombers, Kates, wings flashing red suns. Move, he roared, shoving the sailors toward cover. The first bomb screamed down, slamming the USS Arizona's deck. The explosion ripped the morning apart, a fireball blooming as steel groaned and split. Dan hit the ground, ears ringing, shrapnel slicing the air. Sailors scattered, some frozen, others sprinting for anti-aircraft guns. The sky darkened with planes, strafing runs stitching the water with bullets. Henry reached the Pennsylvania, scrambling up a ladder to a 5-inch gun. Come on, he yelled, cranking the barrel skyward. A Zero banked low, its machine guns chattering, and Henry ducked as rounds sparked off the turret. He fired blind, the gun's boom shaking his bones, but the plane twisted away and scathed. Across the harbor, the Arizona shuddered again, a second hit igniting her forward magazine. The blast was apocalyptic, 1,000 pounds of powder detonating, lifting her bow from the water before she cracked in half. Flames roared skyward, black smoke choking the dawn. Henry froze, staring, as screams pierced the chaos, men burning, drowning, trapped. Dan dragged himself up, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. He stumbled toward a fallen sailor, a kid barely 18, leg mangled by debris. Hold on, Dan shouted, hauling him toward a shed as bombs rained down. The USS Oklahoma groaned nearby, listing hard, her hull torn open like paper. Another explosion rocked Ford Island, hangars erupting in orange plumes. Henry abandoned the gun, racing to a radio post. Mayday, mayday, he yelled into the mic. Pearl's under attack. Japanese planes, hundreds. Where's the damn air cover? Static answered, then a faint voice. All stations hold position. Reinforcements inbound. He smashed the set, cursing. Too late. Dan reached the shed, laying the kid against a wall. The boy's eyes fluttered, voice weak. Why didn't they warn us? Dan had no answer, just a sick certainty clawing his chest. He stepped out, staring at the carnage, ships sinking, men dying, the harbor a graveyard of fire and steel. The radar. Henry's warning. Tyler's shrug. It clicked, brutal and clear. They knew, he whispered, fists clenching. A Zero roared overhead, its shadow crossing his face, and he screamed into the inferno. They knew. In Washington, the radio crackled to life. A voice shaky. Pearl Harbor attacked. Heavy losses. Roosevelt sank into his chair, crutches clattering to the floor. Hopkins stood pale but said nothing. The president's hands shook as he lit a cigarette, the flame trembling. Outside, the Capitol slept, oblivious to the dawn breaking red across the Pacific. The White House glowed under a gray December sky, its windows reflecting the muted roar of a nation waking to war. Inside Franklin D. Roosevelt sat at his desk, December 8, 1941, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the scratch of his pen. His day of infamy, speech lay half-drafted, words like treachery and resolve bleeding ink across the page. His hands trembled, not from fatigue, but from the newsreels flickering in his mind. Pearl Harbor in ruins, 2,403 dead, 1,178 wounded, battleships smoldering husks. He'd seen the first photos, black and white ghosts of his choice. The door creaked open, and Lieutenant Margaret Garland stormed in, her Navy uniform rumpled, eyes red-rimmed with fury and grief. She clutched a singed folder, scraps of burned intercepts she'd salvaged from the Oval Office trash, fragments of the truth Roosevelt had torched. Her brother, Sean, was among the missing on the Arizona, and the weight of it carved her voice raw. "You knew," she said, slamming the folder on his desk. Ash fluttered free, dusting the speech. "The ciphers, the coordinates. You knew they'd hit Pearl, and you let them die." Roosevelt looked up, his face a mask of exhaustion, eyes hollow behind his spectacles. He set the pen down, deliberate, and lit a cigarette, the flare of the match briefly illuminating the lines etched deep into his skin. "Sit down, Lieutenant," he said, voice steady but frayed at the edges. "I won't," Maggie snapped, fists clenched. "Sean's gone, burned or drowned, I don't even know, and you sat here, burning evidence while he slept in his bunk. Why?" Roosevelt exhaled, smoke curling like a shroud. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and met her gaze. "Because I had to," he said, each word a stone dropping into silence. "Japan was a gun cocked at the world. Us, China, the Pacific. Hitler's worse, chewing through Europe like a plague. We pushed them, Maggie, cut their oil, their steel, their lifeline. I knew they'd bite. I didn't know where, not for sure, but Pearl, it was a risk I took." "A risk?" Her voice broke, a sob masquerading as a laugh. "You gambled with lives, my brother's life." "Yes," he said, unflinching. "And I'd do it again. If they hadn't struck, we'd still be debating scrap metal quotas while Hitler took Moscow, London, everything. Japan would have swallowed Asia unchecked. Millions more would die, tens of millions, if we stayed asleep. This woke us. It had to." Maggie staggered back, tears spilling now. "You're a monster," she whispered. "Hiding behind necessity doesn't make it right." "No," Roosevelt agreed, voice softening. "It doesn't, but it makes it true." He tapped the folder, ash smearing the burned edges. "You want to hate me? Go ahead. I hate myself some nights. But those boys didn't die for nothing. They bought us a chance to save the world." She stared at him, disgust warring with a flicker of understanding she couldn't stomach. Without another word, she turned and fled, the door slamming shut behind her. Roosevelt sank back, cigarette dangling, and closed his eyes. The faces haunted him, Sean Garland, the Arizona's crew, all those names he'd never know. Necessary, he told himself. But the word tasted like ash. At Pearl Harbor, Dan Harrow knelt in the wreckage, the harbor still smoldering behind him. The air reeked of oil and charred flesh, a graveyard of twisted steel stretching to the horizon. He held a shovel, digging a shallow trench for Henry Murphy's body. His friend's chest torn open by a Zero's strafing run, eyes frozen wide in death. Dan's hands shook, dirt caking the blood on his knuckles. He'd pulled Henry from the Pennsylvania's deck, too late to save him, too late for anything but this. "They knew," he muttered, voice hoarse from smoke and rage. The radar blips, Tyler's dismissal, Kimmel's orders. It all pointed back to Washington. Roosevelt. He'd pieced it together in the chaos. The fleet left exposed, the warnings ignored, the embargoes that baited Japan into striking. A setup. A sacrifice. He stood, wiping sweat from his brow, and stared at the Arizona's sunken hulk, her guns jutting like broken bones. Over 1,000 men trapped inside, their screams silenced by water and fire. He'd vowed to expose it, tell the world what Roosevelt had done. But as he looked at Henry's still face, doubt gnawed. What if it was necessary? What if this hell was the price of stopping something worse? Back in Washington, Roosevelt limped to the Capitol, aides flanking him as he gripped his cane. Congress buzzed with fury, senators and representatives clamoring for blood, Japan's, anyone's. He took the podium, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, and began. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The chamber erupted, cheers and war cries drowning the rest. They wanted this now, needed it, and he'd given it to them. He finished, eyes scanning the room, and saw the fire he'd lit. The nation was awake, a giant roused by pain, ready to fight. But as he stepped back, the weight crashed down. Those boys at Pearl, Maggie's tears, the truth he'd buried. His knees buckled slightly, an aide catching him, and he waved them off, forcing a smile. Necessary, he repeated silently, but the hollow in his chest grew. Outside, radios blared his words across cities and farms, factories and homes. In Pearl's ruins, Dan laid Henry's dog tags in the dirt, whispering, "Rest, brother." In the White House, Maggie burned her folder in a trash can, sobs racking her as the last evidence curled to nothing. And Roosevelt sat alone, staring at the speech, the roar of a nation at war echoing through his bones. His gambit complete, his soul fractured. The wind carried the stench of oil and rust across Pearl Harbor, 3 months gone since the attack, March 1942. Lieutenant Commander Dan Harrow stood on the shore, the water lapping at his boots, a letter trembling in his hands. He'd written it to Maggie Garland, every word a shard of the truth. Roosevelt's foreknowledge, the burned ciphers, the fleet left to die. The Arizona loomed behind him, half sunk, a tomb for over 1,000 souls. Henry's grave lay a few yards back, a crude cross marking the spot. Dan's eyes stung, not from the wind, but from the weight of what he held. He'd meant to send it, expose the betrayal, let the world judge. But as he stared at the horizon, newsreels echoed in his mind. Japan overreaching in the Pacific, Hitler raging at America's entry, Allied ships steaming to war. The giant was awake, its fists swinging, and the tide was shifting. He saw Henry's face, heard his laugh, and whispered, "For the world." He struck a match, the flame licking the paper, and watched it burn, ash scattering into the sea. The truth died with it, a secret he'd carry alone. In Washington, Franklin Roosevelt sat in the map room, a map of the globe splayed before him. The clock ticked past midnight, the White House silent save for the rustle of papers. An aide slipped in, voice low. "Sir, reports from Midway, Japan's stretched thin. And the Germans, they're bogged down in Russia. Your call paid off." Roosevelt nodded, a ghost of a smile tugging his lips. "Good," he rasped, lighting a cigarette. The smoke curled upward, a frail victory banner. He traced the map. Red lines retreating in Europe, black arrows faltering in Asia. Pearl had ignited it all. The embargoes that provoked, the radar ignored, the fleet sacrificed. The world was fighting back now, a chance bought with blood. But the triumph hollowed him. He saw the faces, Sean Garland, Henry Murphy, the nameless dead, each a debt he'd never repay. The aide left, and Roosevelt's shoulders slumped, the cigarette falling to the desk. "Forgive me," he murmured, voice cracking, to no one but the shadows. He collapsed into his chair, eyes wet, the map blurring as exhaustion claimed him. Necessary, he'd told himself 1,000 times. Tonight, it sounded like a plea. Across the country, radios crackled with fresh newsreels. U.S. troops boarding transports, factories roaring with steel and shells, a nation reborn in fury. In San Diego, Dan's wife clutched his last letter. "I'm coming home, but not the same," and wept silently. In a Navy cryptanalysis office, Maggie Garland stared at her desk, the ashes of her evidence long swept away. She'd resigned that morning, unable to wear the uniform that hid her brother's killers. She whispered his name, Sean, and walked into the dawn lost. At Pearl, Dan turned from the water, the burned letter's weight lifting, if only a little. The harbor lay quiet, a scar healing slow, while ships sailed out to fight, avenging, redeeming, enduring. He saluted Henry's grave, a final goodbye, and boarded the Pennsylvania, her guns primed for war. In Washington, Roosevelt slept at last, dreaming of fire and waves, of a world saved and a soul damned. The newsreel played on, its voice rising. America marches to victory. The ashes of Pearl settled, a silent witness to the cost, as the giant roared on, carrying the dawn.